Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Linda Ehrlich-Jones from the Center for Rehabilitation Outcomes Research, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Employment for People with Parkinson's Disease, Team-Based Strategies and Resources. I would like to recognize the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research for their support of our work and this presentation today. Our speakers today are Dr. Miriam Rafferty. Dr. Rafferty is a research scientist at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, an assistant professor in the departments of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Rafferty will be speaking on employment-related problems in Parkinson's disease and interdisciplinary management. Our second speaker is Pamela Palmentera, a social worker at Northwestern Medicine in the Movement Disorders Clinic. Ms. Palmentera will be addressing resources for employment-related questions in Parkinson's disease, a social work perspective. Our final speaker is Pamela Capraro, a vocational rehabilitation consultant at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab's Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment for People with Physical Disabilities. Ms. Capraro will speak on accommodations for employment challenges in Parkinson's disease. These are our speakers' disclosures, and at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Miriam Rafferty, Pamela Palmentera, and Pamela Capraro, and I will now turn the webinar over to them.
Thank you, Linda. So as Linda mentioned, today we'll be talking about team-based strategies and resources for people with Parkinson's disease and their employment challenges. I'm a physical therapist by background, and during my physical therapy evaluations and treatments with people who had early Parkinson's disease, who were newly diagnosed, I began to get many questions about disclosure and whether or not they could keep their jobs, and even sometimes if they should tell their families. And these were questions that as a physical therapist, I didn't have the background to answer. And that led me to speak with Pam, my social worker and vocational rehabilitation counselors, and I realized that they had a lot of information that the traditional interdisciplinary teams in Parkinson's disease didn't have. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that information with you today. Today you'll learn about some of the common employment challenges for people with Parkinson's disease. We'll examine opportunities for early intervention to address those employment challenges and how they can be addressed by the interdisciplinary care team, and we'll be describing some resources and accommodations to help people with Parkinson's disease retain their employment. After I begin with the introduction and background, I'll be passing the torch off to my colleagues. So I have to begin with some obligatory statistics on Parkinson's disease. Approximately 60,000 people are diagnosed with Parkinson's each year, and this number is projected to grow. So right now there are about 700,000 people in 2010 who are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and that will be nearly 1 million by next year. You might think that this is really just a problem that affects older people, so why are we worried about employment? And the reason is because 40% of people with Parkinson's disease are diagnosed before the age of 60. This should be when they're in their prime early years, focused on saving up for retirement, and taking advantage of the employer-sponsored health insurance that they're getting through their jobs. Men are more likely to be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which also can be a problem if they are the primary breadwinner for their family. The Parkinson's literature shows that people with Parkinson's disease exit the workforce 5 years earlier than people without Parkinson's disease on average, and people who are diagnosed young generally are leaving the workforce a median of 7 years after their diagnosis. This results in $2.5 billion of lost productivity nationally in the United States due to job loss, decreased earnings, missed days of work, lower disability and retirement payments, and most importantly in this population, the loss of employer-sponsored health insurance. The employment challenges that people have with Parkinson's disease can be related to motor, cognitive, communication, or affective disorders. The motor disorders in this movement disorder are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to employment. The gross motor functions that they could have problems with that could affect their employment include walking, balance, stiffness, and fatigue. And fine motor symptoms such as dexterity, tremor, handwriting, and typing can also be very disabling for somebody in their job. This can cause them to slow down and be less productive or have more errors at work. It can also cause them to have safety problems. The non-motor symptoms are really where what I hear the most of my people with Parkinson's disease talking about their challenges. And sometimes they even have a hard time identifying that these could be related to Parkinson's disease, particularly if they're newly diagnosed. So some of the non-motor symptoms that they might have include cognitive problems, which can cause cognitive fatigue, executive function disorders that could limit their ability to multitask and organize complex projects, and they can have problems with their attention or concentration at work. They can also have communication changes, and the voice is the most commonly known communication problem in Parkinson's disease, but facial masking or lack of expression in their face when they're speaking to their clients could impair that relationship building that is necessary in the workplace. They also could have affective problems with anxiety, stress management, depression, and apathy that could make it very difficult for them to be productive at work. When I started realizing a lot of these problems that my patients were having, and as they were bringing to me in physical therapy, I wanted to see what information was available to help guide addressing their employment challenges. I found that there were a lot of articles that supported my observation about the presence of employment challenges in people with Parkinson's disease, but there wasn't a lot of research showing what should be done about it. One review suggested that vocational rehabilitation counseling could be beneficial, but it didn't tell me what that vocational rehabilitation counselor would do. And it was really hard to figure that out because I didn't have a lot of experience working with my vocational rehabilitation colleagues. I also interestingly found one study that suggested that PT and exercise was more effective in people who were employed, which I'm not sure if I can explain the results of that study, but I thought that that was really interesting and was another reason why we should try to help people with Parkinson's disease to retain their employment. What I did find were a lot of information sheets from the major Parkinson's advocacy groups, and these were very kind of focused on the stakeholders and people with Parkinson's disease. The problem with these is that some are from the United States and some are international documents, and some of them are outdated and don't share the latest legislative changes that have happened in the United States, so it can be really difficult for people with Parkinson's disease to find their best information. I also found some resources online that were geared more towards employers. One of these was from the Society for Human Resource Management, and another was from the Job Accommodation Network. The Job Accommodation Network was fabulous, and Pamela Capraro will talk to you a little bit more about this organization later in the talk. But one of the things that was interesting about this is that it lists a lot of possible accommodations for people with Parkinson's disease. That can be very informational for you or for another clinician who can say, you're having X problem, here are a couple different options for accommodations. But it can be very overwhelming for a person with Parkinson's disease or an employer of somebody with Parkinson's disease because it might give too much information, and you might not want your employer to think about potential accommodations for a cognitive problem when in fact you're having a fine motor problem. So it wasn't exactly, I think, what people with Parkinson's needed. We then did a needs assessment. We did focus groups of people with Parkinson's disease and clinicians, and we were able to boil down the needs into 3 key areas. The first area is the need for information, and this was a need expressed by both people with Parkinson's disease and clinicians. People with Parkinson's disease are here, that's abbreviated as PWP. They had a lot of confusion regarding the roles of clinicians related to employment challenges. They weren't clear on the differences between occupational therapy and vocational rehabilitation. They thought maybe their doctors could give them this information, and they didn't realize that there were so many resources that were out there already for them. A lot of them were referring to Joe Blow's blog on how he dealt with his employment problem and not looking at the more comprehensive and valid sources. Clinicians also expressed that they needed knowledge on employment challenges. We heard from clinicians that they were giving patients advice with a very rosy picture of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And our speakers later today will talk to you a little bit more about the realities of about how the Americans with Disabilities Act protects people with Parkinson's disease. The second key area or need that we found was that people with Parkinson's disease need somebody to start the discussion about employment challenges. They frequently had this on their list, or as I said before, they might be experiencing job-related changes that they haven't put their finger on quite yet, or they haven't identified that that challenge was related to their Parkinson's disease. And so they said that it didn't always come up in their doctor's visits. It might have been low on their list of priorities of the things to discuss during that visit. So they identified a need that the clinician or somebody should ask them about their employment to prompt them to think about it. And they wanted that person to then refer them to the appropriate service. They had a preference for that to be their neurologist. They really value the information their neurologists share with them. The problem is that they also recognized that the neurologists were very busy during their session, and so the neurologist might not have enough time to talk to them about it. So that led us to the need that people with Parkinson's and clinicians need to access specialists who have true employment expertise and the availability to speak with the patient at length about their problems. That individualized discussion is really important. The third need that we found was that employment-related interventions need to be individualized and preferably be proactive. The timing of the intervention should be when the person is experiencing an employment challenge, or even before that employment challenge starts when they can anticipate it, and before it becomes an employment crisis. And what we heard from people with Parkinson's disease as well as clinicians is that they frequently didn't hear about an employment problem until there was a real crisis happening at work. The team-based approach to retaining safe and effective work right now appears to be a little bit disorganized, even in the expert center where we work. The traditional interdisciplinary team has a lot of people, including neurologists, physician assistants, nurse practitioners and nurses, social workers, nurse educators, clinical coordinators, allied health therapists of all varieties, and other physicians as well, including physical medicine, rehabilitation, and primary care. And while many of these people are aware of employment challenges, it doesn't frequently come up. It does seem like where this information is most commonly held, or the expertise is with the social workers or nurse educators, depending on the center. The problem is that frequently these clinicians are not interacting with patients, except right when they're newly diagnosed sometimes, or then when there's a crisis happening, and then the doctor will say, you should talk to the social worker about this, or maybe a coordinator can help you coordinate this complex need. So what we did at our center to try to organize things a little bit better is we're trying to develop a screening process where somebody's asking the patient if they're still working, if they're having any challenges, or if they have any concerns about their safety at work, as well as if their employer might have any concerns about their safety at work. We're also trying to have our team communicate more about employment needs, sharing information with each other, as well as educating people with Parkinson's disease. And we're trying to do this early after diagnosis. So we've developed a handout that we're going to test with our patients with Parkinson's disease who are newly diagnosed that will help them better anticipate the potential for employment challenges and know how different members of the team can help them. We're really taking a transdisciplinary approach to the employment problem. We are an interdisciplinary rehabilitation hospital, but even so, all of our therapists aren't quite sure of the overlap of employment challenges. So with this approach, we are going to identify that it could be one of many different clinicians who could address the employment challenge, and all the clinics are structured differently, and patients are going to be seeing different clinicians. They might tell one clinician one thing, and they might not tell their doctor. So we really need to make sure that we all have the basic knowledge to address employment challenges, and that's one of the reasons that our social worker and vocational rehabilitation counselor will be presenting in this talk, because they can help share that information to a much greater extent than I can as a physical therapist. And each center we would recommend should identify one go-to person who has specialized knowledge related to employment. There are a lot of specialty laws out there that are federal or state laws that are different, and it's impossible probably to maintain this knowledge in your entire team, but trying to have one go-to person would be important. Does anybody have any questions for me before we continue on to social work? Hearing none, I'm going to pass the pointer over to Pamela Palmentera.
Thank you, Miriam. I appreciate that, and I appreciate being a part of this. I have learned a lot in this process, and I'm grateful for that. First of all, living well with Parkinson's is the same for all of us in living well. We are whole human beings who operate intellectually, spiritually, or existentially, physically, emotionally, and socially. I encourage people to continue to work because often as we engage on these planes of our whole human being, these are also fulfilled at work as well. So it has a financial aspect as well as a social and intellectual stimulation. So work provides many purposes for us. How can social workers help? Social workers wear many hats. Basically, we navigate sticking points that people are experiencing in their lives. We offer support, counsel, resources, as well as just being a sounding board as people process what is happening to them. I'm bringing up specifically lawyers because oftentimes we're asked by a patient with Parkinson's, do you think I need a lawyer? The United States absolutely is one of the most litigious societies that exists. However, there is a burden or a cost that comes from hiring an attorney, and those also need to be part in factoring whether you get one or not. Illinois is an at-will state, meaning an employer can terminate an employee for any reason except for discrimination. Often, if someone feels like they've been discriminated against, they can file a case with the EEOC. Do know that less than 3% of the cases filed with the EEOC on the behalf of a disability are actually won. So that means 97% are lost. The second part is when people are going to file for Social Security disability, they feel like they need an attorney. You see all the ads on TV about what attorneys can get you if you secure their services. I do recommend that people first go through the appeal process, which we'll get more into before securing an attorney. Social Security has an internal appeal process before it goes to the court system. When it goes to the court system, someone may have a better benefit in having an attorney present versus the internal appeal process. The first part, if someone does not get their benefits awarded, they can request reconsideration. If that fails, they go to an administrative law judge. What's interesting about the administrative law judge is 50% of those who file actually win their appeal. If someone does hire a disability lawyer, they sign a contract for payment. Social Security pays them directly. They pay up to 25% of the back pay or up to $6,000. An attorney can file a petition if they feel like they've gone above and beyond the normal workload for filing that appeal. The next part that social workers get involved with is FMLA, or the Family and Medical Leave Act. As you probably know, it's 12 weeks in a 12-month period. It is unpaid unless your employer allows you to access any PTO benefits, which is usually sick or vacation. The one thing that is really important that often we don't recognize is you can use FMLA for a variety of reasons: for overnight stays in the hospital, for medical appointments or procedures, or even to adjust your work schedule. I knew a gentleman who was a janitor in a school. They were adjusting his medications. He became extremely fatigued in the afternoon. So while that adjustment was happening, he worked in the morning. He took FMLA for a couple hours in the afternoon, and he came back to work late afternoon, early evening. So he was able to use it intermittently. So there are creative ways in which people can use FMLA to help in their work lives. I wanted to have this worksheet so people can kind of easily tell if they are eligible for FMLA. Not everyone is. What's important to remember is that you need to be part of a company that has more than 50 employees. Also, you need to work 1,250 hours in the last 12 months, which is 24 hours a week. So if you're part-time below 24 hours, automatically you do not qualify for FMLA. Social workers are usually called in when it's a Social Security disability, when people say, I can't work anymore, I need to apply for disability. Disability is what's taken out of your check every year. You pay into it. It is not welfare. What's important to know about disability is that it's an easy online application. I encourage people to apply online, primarily because you can check the status. An application takes anywhere from 3 to 6 months to do. Your benefit depends on how much you've paid in. The government looks at, Social Security looks at the last 10 years that you've worked. So when people who have a chronic disease are saying, I can't work full-time, maybe I'll go part-time, they really need to consider going part-time because it may affect their monthly benefit in the long run. So that's something that people need to be aware of. The average amount in the U.S. for disability benefits is about $1,200, which is a little less than $15,000 a year. It's really important that people know SSDI is not a golden ticket. It does affect people's financial picture. One thing that goes into play, though, it also affects insurance. The majority of Americans get their health insurance from their employer. If you apply for SSDI, oh, I'm sorry, we'll go back. I'm out of order, I apologize. Parkinson's is a disease that is usually diagnosed after the age of 60. People may be closer to retirement than Social Security disability. If someone is going to apply for retirement, this is once again what you paid into will affect your benefits. It's an easy online application. The government even has online calculations so that you can estimate what your monthly payment will be. The earliest you can apply is at 62. It affects the age that you retire, affects your benefits. And often people, quote unquote, retire too early. And so if someone can extend the age of which they retirement, their benefits can go up drastically. That brings us to health insurance. If someone applies for SSDI, disability, they can apply for Medicare only after a 24-month period. If they were getting their health insurance from their employer prior, they can access COBRA, which lasts for 18 months. This means they are taking on the portion they pay as well as the portion the employer pays for that health insurance. If they access COBRA and there's still a 24-month period, they have 6 months that are uncovered waiting for health insurance that you have to go through a private insurance company. So that's really important. A lot of people think that they get SSDI, they automatically get Medicare, which is not the case. A lot of people that I deal with continue to work not so much for the paycheck, but to maintain insurance. And that's one of the greatest difficulties that people have navigating is the insurance. If someone applies for SSDI and their income is below a Medicaid threshold of about $17,000, they may also apply for SSI and Medicaid. Please know that Medicaid is an Illinois benefit, so Medicaid changes from state to state. You really need to be aware of what the benefit is in your state. If someone is applying for Medicaid or SSI, please talk to a social worker. It gets very complicated very quickly. The last thing I really invite people to do is if they're doing online research, that they use trusted resource materials. These are ones that I most often access. There's good information. The other one is from the government. So if you do Social Security, make sure it's a .gov website so that you're getting accurate information. If you Google disability, The first 10 ones will be from an attorney trying to get your business. So please scroll down, make sure people are accessing the .gov website. Again, there's lots of information, lots of brochures, lots of easy to read things, items in these areas. Are there any questions? That's a lot of information in a little bit of time.
That's a great question. One of the questions that just came in is, what should I tell my patients when they tell me that they are thinking of talking to a lawyer?
The first thing I invite people to do is to see what the outcome they are hoping for and what the benefit or cost is. Attorneys are very expensive. So if you're looking for a little return, it might not be worth the time, nor the energy, nor the money to secure an attorney. So it really depends on what they're looking for, how much the benefit will be, and how much they're willing to pay.
Great, thank you, Pam. Now I'll be passing it on to Pamela Capraro from Vocational Rehabilitation.
Thank you, Miriam. Before we get started on the VR part of the presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Americans with Disability Act. This was signed into law in 1990. The ADA is a comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation that protects people with disabilities in 5 main sections known as titles. Today's presentation covers Title I and employment. Title I prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. Employers with 15 or more employees must comply with this law. For purposes of today's discussion, it's important to note that the ADA does not protect an individual from being terminated for performance-related issues. Vocational rehabilitation counseling has multiple facets and involves many different duties, but the primary purpose is to assist people with disabilities in retaining or obtaining employment who might not otherwise be able to do so. Participants may receive counseling, guidance, vocational evaluation, job placement, and job retention support as part of their services. VR can increase the likelihood that a person with Parkinson's will retain employment. We do this by providing counseling which addresses adjustment to disability, advises people on their various options, such as disclosure, accommodations, timing of retirement, filing for disability, and connect them with resources such as support groups, assistive technology, and benefits specialists. There are some limitations. More often than not, VR is not covered by private health insurance, although this can vary by the state you live in. Although there are many Parkinson's Foundation Centers of Excellence throughout the country, there are few, less than 9 hospital-based VR programs in the United States. There are vocational rehabilitation programs run by the individual states, but the level of experience in serving people with Parkinson's is often limited. A thorough initial assessment is conducted for every individual who comes to vocational rehabilitation for services. The purpose of this assessment is to review the person's medical, educational, and employment information. This is done so the VR counselor gets a better sense of what a person's employment-related concerns and challenges are. Part of the assessment involves identifying an individual's strengths and weaknesses as they relate to employment. We always use this opportunity to reassure the client that jobs are retained based on the strengths they bring to their work. Often, in cases with Parkinson's disease, people have a long work history with a company. That can be their strength. Companies don't want to lose good employees and may be willing to make accommodations to retain them. It is the job of the VR counselor to help the client figure out if that is a possibility and how they can do it. Vocational rehabilitation can help people go over job descriptions, job skills, work behaviors, and endurance. We can assist people with determining appropriate self-accommodations. We maintain contact with the employer as needed, with the client as needed to monitor for progress toward goals. We communicate with the employer, but only with client consent to discuss accommodation possibilities. Lastly, we provide counseling on disclosure. VR counselors often work with medical teams to coordinate a person's return to work following a medical event, such as a recovery from a serious fall or deep brain stimulation surgery. In those cases, we use the person's current medical status and assist them in planning for return to work based on any changes in impairment level, temporary or permanent. We also can advise them on recommendations for accommodations and can assist them with making the request. If the VR counselor is part of a hospital-based team, we will often do a worksite evaluation to assist in developing reasonable accommodations. There are a lot of do's and don'ts for disclosure. The timing and method of disclosure is critical to its success. Generally speaking, we usually recommend that people wait to disclose when they need an accommodation for Parkinson's-related symptoms. Many employers, especially the larger ones, have formal processes such as HR, or an EEOC office, whose role it is to process requests. In smaller companies or companies without departments set up to process requests, disclosure can be made to a manager or supervisor directly. It's important for individuals to be selective about who they disclose to in their work environment. I always recommend that people tell others on a need-to-know basis. With regard to the how, when requesting an accommodation, you need to let the employer know it is for a medical condition. The employer can ask for limited information to verify, such as a note from the doctor, but the specific details are not required. It is important not to disclose too early, remembering that it should be done when a person needs an accommodation. But it is also important not to disclose too much. I would always recommend incremental disclosure as needs change that may impact jobs. The worst thing an individual can do is to go to their employer with a list of Parkinson's-related scenarios. As professionals, we realize that every person doesn't manifest every symptom, and we don't want to make an employer overly apprehensive about retaining an employee. The last point about disclosure is not to disclose too late. Once an employment crisis or poor performance event has occurred, it may be too late, and in extreme cases, the individual can be terminated for cause. I had a case once of a client who was an accountant, and he had been missing deadlines for several months because his fine motor control had been impacted by his Parkinson's. Unfortunately, the employer wasn't aware he had a medical condition, and the employee had never asked for an accommodation. As a result, his work suffered, and he was written up on numerous occasions. Eventually, he was terminated by an employer. That's a scenario that we never want to see happen, and early intervention can stop that from happening. It is also important for the VR counselor to maintain contact with the client with Parkinson's, either in person or telephonically. This allows us to help identify the person's current Parkinson's-related employment challenges, such as gross motor or fine motor issues, problems with cognition, communication, mood, or energy levels. This allows us to help the person retain their job and educate them on developing an awareness of potential employment challenges prior to them becoming problems. We can then advise them on what symptoms should be addressed and improved medically versus those which then can be addressed via an accommodation. In the event that an accommodation is needed, we can make recommendations such as equipment, schedule change, or rest break, and talk through instances when the client can self-accommodate, such as pacing and proper nutrition. There are numerous sources of information available for people with Parkinson's. It is so important for people to have accurate information about their disease and their rights related to employment and accommodations. JAN is an excellent source of accurate information. Knowledge is power, and the more people know about accommodations, the easier it will be for them to make the request. We always advise our clients that when they approach their employer with an accommodation request and come armed with the solution, the likelihood that the request be granted goes up significantly. Remember, most accommodations are under $250 and many are free. Everything we as professionals can do to help people with Parkinson's retain employment will help them economically and psychologically for years to come. Do you have any questions?
That's a great question. How would somebody find a vocational rehabilitation counselor in their area?
If you don't have access or are unaware of a vocational program in your area, you can go online to the American Job Center. This is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor, and I believe the address is included in the handout materials.
Yes. Natasha, can you add that website to the chat box for participants?
And the best part about this is it's location specific. So you would type in your area code and they would come up with a list of possible resources for you. The site also gives a lot of great information on the ADA, job accommodations, etc.
Great, thank you. So this is Miriam again. I'm going to move on to a brief summary, and then we'll do a case discussion with myself and Pamela to talk about how we would address an individual with Parkinson's disease. So my summary is that there are 5 key things to remember. Somebody needs to ask the person with Parkinson's disease if they're having any employment challenges. They need to share or communicate that with their team. They need to identify a team member who has specialized expertise, like Pamela Capraro and Pamela Palmentera, a social worker or vocational rehabilitation counselor in their area. They need to educate their clients and colleagues and prepare to help the client stay in control of their work situation. We really feel that it's important that people be proactive. So I'd like to discuss a recent patient that I had where I was able to talk with my social worker and vocational rehabilitation counselor colleagues to help the person get the information that they needed. I was seeing a 52-year-old female who was a pediatric occupational therapist. She'd been diagnosed a couple years before, and she was seeing me in physical therapy to help with her exercise routine. In my conversations with her, she let me know that she had self-accommodated about a year after her diagnosis. She went from working with a fixed clinic schedule in an outpatient environment to a flexible home-based therapy schedule. She was working for the same employer, but she could pick the times that she scheduled clients, and she was able to start a little bit later in the day and take breaks throughout the day. She'd reported to me, though, that she was having some problems with her documentation, charting in the system, and writing her reports for her early intervention evaluations. When we were talking in our physical therapy session, she was talking about potentially cutting down to part-time work. She was thinking about deep brain stimulation for surgery, but didn't know if she could return to work after that. And she had some questions about disclosing to her supervisors. And this is where I actually thought that it might be helpful for her to talk to both the social worker and a vocational rehabilitation counselor to help plan some of these progressions in her disease. So the questions for the social worker were, how could she plan for her deep brain stimulation surgery and return to work? And what about thinking about part-time work?
So first things first, everyone is the expert in their own life. So I asked them to really look at what their life, their financial picture is, as well as accessing the benefits package from their individual work. Lots of times this is online so people can read what their benefits packet is. Or if they can't get it online, they can go to their human resources and ask for the benefits packet. They do not need to disclose the benefits packet is yours as a right as an employee. The second thing to consider is how her benefits change if she goes part-time. If she's going to be full-time and then go to DBS surgery, then also looking at FMLA and how that would impact her life. Most FMLA services are outsourced, so also to find out from the HR who that company is that manages it, because there's usually paperwork, there is paperwork that needs to accompany any kind of request for FMLA.
And I see that there's a question. I'll answer that as soon as we're finished with the case. For Pamela Capraro from Vocational Rehabilitation, what would you do to help her with accommodations and disclosure?
Well, first of all, as we said before, since she's already experienced some issues at work, I would encourage her to go to her employer and disclose, remembering she doesn't have to disclose the full gamut of symptoms she's experiencing, but it would be important to disclose so that she can request an accommodation. And it sounds from what you said, Marion, that she does require an accommodation for the job. And that would also complement the FMLA that Pam Palmentera had recommended.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that as her case progressed, she did disclose her information. In particular, she was worried because she worked for a healthcare provider that they would know that something was wrong with her and might be guessing. And she was able to get some accommodations to help with voice-to-text software for her to be able to do her reports in a more timely manner in a way that was more comfortable for her. Do you have anything else to add? Okay. I'm going to address questions now. So if anybody has any questions, please add them to the chat box to all participants. One question that came in is from an occupational therapist who worked in a vocational rehabilitation setting for over 3 years. That's great. She was a part of a comprehensive team, and OT had an extensive role in employment. And she's just wondering when we include occupational therapy as a part of our team. And that's a great question. I can speak from our traditional Parkinson's disease and movement disorders clinic. We do have a proactive occupational therapy program. We try to get people with Parkinson's disease to come to our rehabilitation program soon after diagnosis. For physical therapy, we are getting our patients sometimes within the first month after they're diagnosed with a movement disorders neurologist, or after that movement disorders neurologist confirms their diagnosis. Some of those patients also go to occupational therapy at that time, and the occupational therapist is definitely screening for employment issues. And then our occupational therapist will refer on to assistive technology specialists if that appears to be the right way or a need for the patient. They also might help us get the patient to speech therapy. Unfortunately, something that we've found, and maybe this is a local issue, but I think it's more general, is that people with Parkinson's disease are more open to accepting an early referral to physical therapy than they are open to referrals to other providers. In part, I think that that's a PR problem where they're concerned that if they're going to occupational therapy or speech therapy or counseling of any type, that those disciplines have more stigma associated with them. So I think that that's a great opportunity for physical therapists, if we're seeing more people who are early in their disease process, to really talk up the role that our occupational therapist colleagues can have in screening for employment issues. I think this is a great point. Are there any other questions? Great. Well, if there are no other questions, I will turn it over to Linda for some final housekeeping.
So this concludes our webinar for today. I would like to thank Dr. Miriam Rafferty, Ms. Pamela Palmentera, and Ms. Pamela Capraro for their presentation today. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar and have a great rest of your day.